book, I'm going to be doing the subscriber interview, and I'm going to be challenging him to tell us what the secret of the ancient Egyptians was. How can we make the journey out of the whole trap of reincarnation that they made or they believed that they could make? Is there anything we can do now to make this work for us, for subscribers? William Henry, in just a moment, is going to be exploring the Canopus Revelation. And if you're a subscriber, do listen to both programs, because William has an absolutely fascinating take on this deep knowledge, of course, of ancient Egypt and its mythology. So don't miss it. This is Whitley Strieber, and when we come back, it'll be William Henry substituting on Dreamland.
From Nashville, this is William Henry sitting in for Whitley Strieber. This is Dreamland. Welcome, everyone. Our guest today is investigator and journalist Philip Coppens from Scotland. In addition to revealing vital, lost knowledge about the truth behind extraterrestrial contact and military intelligence's interest in ancient Egypt, Philip has also done extensive research on what the Egyptians believed happened to the soul after death. To top it off, he writes about the myths and secret history of Rennes-le-Chateau, the real secret history. He writes about Rosslyn Chapel and much, much more of interest that we'll get into today. He recently appeared at Dreamland favorite guest Andrew Collins' Questing Conference along with Graham Phillips, another Dreamland contributor, where Philip introduced his new and important work, the Canopus Revelation, Stargate of the Gods, and the Ark of Osiris. Are the secrets of the Gate of the Gods about to be revealed by modern science? Let's find out. Philip, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you very much.
Hey, great to have you here. I really thank you very much for taking time to speak with us. I really appreciate it. And in reading your bio, Philip, it looks like you've had a lifetime interest in esoteric studies and enigmas of the past. As you're a new guest, could you just talk for a moment about how you came upon interest in this area and what provokes you to continue today?
I can. It started off about around the age of 18, when I think, like so many other people in this lifetime, you kind of like have to figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life. And I didn't really know, I think, much like any other 18-year-old. So I thought about what I could do, and amongst the choices which I probably didn't consider doing was journalism. So I started doing some kind of like, what kind of journalism would I do? And again, of all the options available, the ones you don't think about are the ones you end up with doing. So I did a bit of investigative journalism, did a bit of local newspaper material, and I got involved into what I would call investigative journalism surrounding the Kennedy assassination and all of those things. And this was the early 1990s when a guy called Bill Cooper, if I remember correctly, started saying a few big tales about why Kennedy was killed, and it involved UFOs, it involved secrets about extraterrestrials, it involved something which he referred to as the Roswell crash, and I'd never heard about. And from there, my life just went what my parents would probably think is a completely wrong way, but what I think is a very funny way, and that's where I am at the moment, in between bypassing such things as Eric von Däniken's Ancient Astronaut material, Temple Revelation, Stargate Conspiracy, and in recent years a few of my own books.
Right, yeah. I wanted to touch on that, Philip, too. The fact that in 1999 you were the principal researcher for Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince's The Stargate Conspiracy. A very controversial book which blew the lid off current politicians' apparent obsession with ancient Egypt and Mars and a possible alien agenda behind politics. Astounding book again. And in your view, do you think Egypt is still the prize, so to speak? Is Egypt still in play?
I think it's more than that. I think it's got to do with the relationship of politics and magic. And in magic, which goes far way back beyond ancient Egypt, you've got the concept of how to control the world through magic, how does the world work, access to other dimensions, access to different knowledge. And ancient Egypt is just one component of this. What we didn't go into the book was how in France at the very same time you had people who started doing exactly the same thing, but there you don't have the emphasis on 9 ancient Egyptian deities. You've got the 9 Templars, So in France, you've got the Argenie revival. But once again, you find politicians are in there from the very word go. And really what was in the Stargate conspiracy, and which applies to American politics, you can apply it with other examples to French politics. And you can, I think, in the history of Rennes le Château, you see examples of how, for example, in 17th century France, people tried doing the same thing, but, within a different concept. So Egypt still is a prized possession, but it's not that we should overemphasize on Egypt. And I think what the Stargate conspiracy tried to do was say exactly that. If you just focus too much on Egypt, you will end up doing some pretty nasty, pretty self-indulgent, pretty, should I say, stupid things.
Yeah, and of course, since the publication of the Stargate Conspiracy in '99, we've had the dramatic moves that the U.S. military and the coalition has made in Iraq, and it appears that it isn't just Egypt, that in fact it really is the entire Middle East that is the concentrated focus of these magicians. And can you, off the top of your head, think of any examples of where this magical worldview is evident in contemporary politics, say within the past year, or anything that's at work right now?
It's a tough question. I think it's always bubbling underneath the surface. When you look at how people like, just for example, British Prime Minister's wife, Cherie Blair, is interested in things which have got to do with what we would call New Age, but, it's kind of like, well, why is she rushing so often to these astrologers? An example, Princess Diana, which is so tabloid, people fail to perhaps see what it's like, but she also rushed to these astrologers. It seems that almost, are they just stupid, or are they actually aware of something more, and are they trying to get that out, if you want, as a guidance to their life? And if you look at, not on a magical sense, but if you look at the politics of George Bush, and even though he then denies it, then underlines the fact that this mission of God thing is very similar to what the magicians of Argenie or his predecessors, including probably his father in the 1970s, were involved with. They have this sense that they are not just mere mortals and that they're just doing what they think is best. They always feel that they are pawns in a much larger game in which God or God are there, and they try to follow God's orders, if you want, to try to find out what the bigger plan, which isn't visible in this world, wants them to do.
Great. Yeah, well, I really appreciate you commenting on that, Philip, because, again, I thought the Stargate Conspiracy was an important work, and you were the person behind that driving the research. At least that seems to be the credit given to you in the book, and so thanks for bringing us up to speed on that. Recently on Dreamland, we've been discussing quite a bit about what I call Stargate myths, mysteries, and metaphysics. And one of the topics that we certainly want to talk with you about as we continue is this concept of the star Canopus as the stargate to the afterlife realm of Osiris in ancient Egyptian religion. And in fact, you go on to describe Canopus as a sort of transformation station where Osiris was transformed into a super god. Can you talk for us a moment about how you came upon this understanding of Canopus, how this star that perhaps many of us have never even heard of, which was the second brightest star in the sky in the ancient world and still is in the southern hemisphere, came to be such a hidden mystery, and why it's so important for us now to understand or get a handle on the Canopus revelation.
Yes, first of all, I think we can't take the Canopus as a stargate literally. It's a symbolism. The Egyptians used Canopus as a symbol to describe how what happened to the soul once the soul died. So it's a symbolic stargate for something which is much more personal, which happens on a metaphysical level when you die. Now, as to why it got forgotten, I have no idea. All I know is that people in recent decades constantly hinted at Canopus, and it came up in the most unusual aspects. It was Robert Temple who while he was writing the Sirius mystery, kept saying, things about Sirius, but at the same time was saying, well, this Canopus thing and this Canopus thing. I was reading a book by John North about Stonehenge, and in there he just makes a comparison how the Kaaba, of such importance to the Arab world, was aligned to Canopus. And all of these things left, right, and center. And I kind of thought, I don't have to do research. I'll just do searching for Canopus, and at the end, I will start to begin to realize what it's all about. Now, at this time, all of this research of Canopus happened shortly after Templar Revelation was written, and I was working at the time together with Clive Prince in preparation for Stargate Conspiracy. And so he kind of went into the British Library trying to find out what this Canopus thing was as well. And he came up upon treatises on Canopus, including one by an Egyptologist called Henry Lubbs. He'd written this in 1947. And he published his research, which is phenomenal, which is fantastic, on Canopus and its importance in Ptolemaic Egypt. And it got printed in 50 copies. Whereas any kind of, between parentheses, crap on anything else would get like a print run of 1,000, if not more, and it would constantly get quoted. It's almost as if, to quote Immanuel Velikovsky, mankind always forgot about Canopus. And the one stunner about Canopus, which kept on kind of being repeated, not just by myself, but by everybody else who came into contact with it, was what happened with Pierre Plantard. Pierre Plantard, pretend or real Grandmaster of the Priory of Zion, in his first ever outing in public in a book by Gerard de Sade on the Templars, he says how the Templar stronghold of Gisors actually is linked with Canopus, and he links this to the sublime eye of the great architect. And I kind of thought, well, where does that one come from? Because here you've got a guy in, the 1960s writing this stuff, and it's kind of completely unbelievable what he writes, and everybody else, including academics, they just kind of were saying, what does he start talking about Canopus? So all of these things just led me to kind of think, why does everybody touch it, but then kind of immediately drops it again?
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back.
Well, guess what? It's a great time to buy in the unknowncountry.com store because we're having our annual post-Christmas sale. Everything in the store is off in price. Many of our prices are literally the lowest on the internet for these valuable books that will help you on your spiritual journey from this unique store. One thing you can be sure of, Ann and I have read every single book in the store, so you really can't go wrong. They're all great, they're all important, and some of them are extremely important. Don't miss the fabulous sale in the unknowncountry.com store. It's a chance to pick up something that could change your life for a song.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're joined today by Philip Coppens, author of The Canopus Revelation. Philip, just before the break, you were giving us sort of an overview of Canopus from the ancient world through Ptolemaic Egypt. Then, lo and behold, in the 1940s, we get a dramatic reference to it in a scholarly text, printed in a very limited edition. And then, right out of left field, we have Pierre Plantard, the mastermind behind the Rennes-le-Chateau enigma, essentially brings forward this very strange term Canopus again. But one of the most interesting connections that I know the Dreamland audience will be eager to learn about is that between Canopus and Nibiru. One of the very interesting lines of research in your book is this correlation between this star and this alleged planet or star of the gods. Talk for a moment about the connection between Canopus and Nibiru.
Okay. Well, here we go into the center of what I think ancient Egyptians believed. So, grant me a bit of indulgence here because we need to come around it in kind of a slightly different way. It's what happens after death. And every religion has got a different interpretation of it. In the book, I kind of underline something which was written by Charles Muses, who makes his first appearance in Stargate Conspiracy.
Now, Charles Muses, by the way, is an American researcher, lived in Colorado, proposed that the body was in pupil form, and that through sound we could transform the body in an afterlife fashion and travel the stars. So, apologize. Just wanted to mention to everybody who Charles Muses is. Go ahead.
Yep, no problem. So he did some research on what he found in Turin Museum on a coffin dating from ancient Egypt. And he came to the conclusion, in short, that the ancient Egyptians believed in three possibilities of what happened after that. One, reincarnation. Two, just staying in this state of not being incarnated, but not necessarily much else happening either. And then what even Stargate SG-1 now call ascension of the soul to something else. Now, what is that something else? We would call it God or the source or the monad, the one, whatever we want to call it. The ancient Egyptians, I think, called it, the blessed divine. And I think, if you look at what the Sumerians talk about it, I think this is where the Nibiru, this other world, this divine abode where the gods are, where you can join the gods, that this is all what ascension really means. Now, this is not something which is typically Egyptian. When you look at writings of physics and metaphysics of one guy, which I'm quite interested in, who's called Amit Goswami, who's a quantum physicist. He's
the physics of the soul, right.
Yes, exactly. He just kind of like writes this as if, quantum physics is all about this. It's, for a quantum physicist, this seems to be self-evident. So, you've got the ancient Egyptians talking about this. Now, I also think that the ancient Egyptians kind of like realized that if there is such a thing as free will, which we claim, is so important in this world, and democracy is all about expressing that free will. If you believe there's such a thing as free will, there has to be, in their opinion, I think, something called absolute free will, which is kind of like intriguing when we come to what religions think about, what life is all about. And in essence, what religions think life is all about is that you've got to live by certain rules, and that you've got to kind of like live a good life and a decent life and all of that stuff, which is, very intriguing and very good to organize societies. But the fact that there are certain rules kind of like doesn't mean, in essence, you don't have free will. So I think that's where, and now we're back with the magicians, I think that's where the free will comes in. I think the ancient Egyptians kind of like realized that there were shortcuts into getting into this afterlife, into this blessed realm of the gods, and that, it just didn't have to happen like the cycle of reincarnation until only the good would ascend to God. I think they just kind of thought, well, if there is such a thing as absolute free will, that means there's an absolute free will as well, and that upon that we can just join the gods in afterlife.
Yeah,
so,
you bring up Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm finished.
You bring up a very important point there, Philip, this idea of free will, because in the Egyptian pyramid text they say, be pure. Be pure. Why? So that you can board the ark or bark of Ra or Re. And then in the Gnostic Pistis Sophia, Jesus responds to a question posed by Mary Magdalene by saying, don't do anything except find the cleansing mysteries that will purify you and transform you into a being of pure light so that you can inherit the light of my kingdom. And that's what you seem to be saying here, is that it wasn't just a state or condition of the heart that guaranteed entrance to the afterlife, but it appears that there were formula involved, perhaps, obviously magical or spiritual techniques. Have you come upon any particular references to that in your research on Canopus?
There are a few scattered references in the book. Most of that material I haven't included because, it's magic, and it's difficult to put in even another layer in a book which is already quite shifting from one subject to another. But just, when you look at the ancient find when you read it and you just say it out loud, it reads like a magical incantation. It constantly repeats, say this, say this, say this, say this, repeat this, repeat this, repeat this, repeat this. It's what magicians still do, this constant talking, this constant saying, this constant uttering of the same word. And, you kind of wonder what, if it's not magic, what, if these Book of the Dead were read to the Pharaoh, kind of after, you said it 5 times now, I get you. But no, these priests keep on repeating it, and the only framework in which, of which I know, and I think nobody else will know, is in magic.
Interesting. One of the most thought-provoking lines of research that you pursue in the Canopus revelation is the link, unexpected, I think, but very, very interesting link between Enki and Osiris. Enki, of course, is the Sumerian lord of the waters, and you also go so far as to say, or to conclude that Enki is also connected with, and or possibly even is, Canopus. Talk about that for a moment.
Okay, there are two sides to this part of the research. One of them is Enki and Osiris, and I think I've forgotten his name, but he's referenced in the book. I thought it's Michael Rice. He is one of those people who draws comparisons between ancient Egypt and Sumeria. It's something which people like Zacharias Sitchin are intrigued about as well, is whether these myths are identical or whether they're completely different. Now, most Egyptologists say that they are completely different. And, let's not argue with them, because they do agree that even if they're entirely different, they are identical in just one aspect, and that is in Osiris and in Enki, and in all their attributes. Osiris in his form as happy as the Nile god, Enki in his characteristic as a water deity as well, and the list kind of goes on. So that's kind of really the main thrust of this, that there were ancient Egyptologists as well, but that Egyptologists in general have kind of identified that Enki and Osiris share something which truly means that, at least that aspect has to come from a common source, or, you've got the most amazing coincidence in the ancient world that two cultures just independently come up with a deity and then give him all identical attributes.
Right. Many of our listeners know, and if they don't know, they should know that Enki, according to Zacharias Sitchin, is or was the genetic engineer who crafted the human body into its present form. And it's interesting that science now shows that high-energy cosmic rays stimulate human evolution and may even cause spontaneous mutation. And what I'm wondering, Philip, is it possible that Enki as Canopus is a force or a vibration from Canopus made flesh? In other words, the light, the sound or vibration even from Canopus may somehow have influenced human DNA in the ancient past. And I wonder, did the ancient Egyptians talk about this? Did they possibly know this for a fact?
Impossible to tell at the moment. I would like to answer that slightly more generally, in the sense that we know that in ancient cultures, certain monuments were aligned to the sunrise, and that this was a very religious experience for them, that people wanted to bathe their body in, for example, the sunrise of the midsummer solstice or something like that. We've got other examples whereby sometimes people try to do this with the light of Venus, or if you look at the Kaaba, perhaps Canopus. We know that in ancient Egypt, certain parts of the temple of Karnak, which is of course the biggest temple ever built, that these certain sections were directed towards Canopus. Now, we know that people wanted to bathe in the light of the sun, that they wanted their body to be touched by the sunlight. We know that temples were built with canopus, so you might imply that it's the same thing. And once again, I think, when we're talking about this vibrational change, I think you also need to look at the magical aspect of this. And the best example I always think is what happened in the Christian world, which was something which was just a complete leftover from Celtic Europe, which is that if you were born and you died before being baptized, children were held towards the sun at sunset, and you've got a site in northern France called Aviot where you can still see this place where that happened. And because the sun touched the child, it made it look as if the eyes moved, because the sun caught the eyes, and it kind of like made it look as if the child was alive. And then straight away it got baptized. Now, obviously here the sun is used as a magical instrument to kind of like do something with the soul of this child. So I think, in short, the answer to your question is there's definitely a lot of material out there which suggests that on a magical level the light of these stars was important. Whether it's merely on a magical level or whether there's something else to it, it's for science to find out. And I'm sure in a few years from now we will be able to answer that. Probably yes.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the early Christian tradition too, because the Gnostic Christians idolized, worshipped a god who was called Snoopus. And when we come back from the break, Philip, I'd like to ask you about that. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland, and we'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. Our guest today is the author Philip Coppens, author of the Canopus Revelation, Stargate of the Gods, and the Ark of Osiris. Philip, just before the break, I wanted to ask you about the Gnostic Christian god, the lion-faced serpent, who was called Snoobus or Canubus. Now, I know word plays and puns are important to some and not as important to others, but I just can't help but make a tentative link between Snoobus or Canubus, this god of wisdom, this serpent god, and Canopus, especially since if Enki was connected with Canopus, it makes it even more of a powerful connection, because Enki was also portrayed as a serpent being. Can you comment about this possible connection between this early Christian god Canubus and Canopus?
Other than to say that I know very little about it, not much really, but I do think that, as time went on, some of these aspects of Canopus got more and more integrated into larger deities, if you want. In the book, I go into how when Manetho is asked by the Ptolemaic Egyptians to reform, in essence, the religion of the ancient Egypt and make it accessible to the ancient Greeks, that he just kind of like realizes that he needs to come up with new deities, and deities which would go to the ancient Greeks as well as to the ancient Egyptians. And so he starts making new gods up, and one of these new gods has got attributes of Osiris, he's got attributes of Hapi, he's got attributes of Canopus, and the name of the new god, of that new god, is Serapis. Right. Obviously, we can kind of like speculate, and I'm not merely speculating and theorizing because I don't know enough about it, that by early Christian times, Serapis was perhaps once again transformed into the name of another deity. But, that's all I really can add to that.
Okay, Phil, thank you. Something I'm personally very interested in is the possibility that our ancestors had the ability to mill or harvest enlightenment substances from the cosmos. And at different times, these substances are called bread. They're called spice, as in the Dune story by Frank Herbert. They're called sage, as in the 7 sages or 7 spices, the 7 rays, the 7 Ra's or 7 stars. Talk about the connection between Dune and Canopus, if you will, because I'm sure there's a lot of Dune fans out there.
Yes, well, it's it was one of these things that when I started doing the initial kind of like, where does Canopus come up, I kind of like, okay, yeah, Frank Herbert writes about this in Dune. And then a few years went past and kind of like, oh yeah, and, I kind of like remembered. And I've seen at a very young age the Dune movie starring Carl McLachlan, if I don't mispronounce his name. And I kind of like thought, okay, that's all I know about this guy. So again, fortunately, there's like TV documentaries, and I think the Sci-Fi Channel did a special on Dune and Children of Dune. So it's kind of like helped me a bit in getting a lot of knowledge in a very quick time about what was moving there with Frank Herbert and Dune. But in essence, the story is that Frank Dune writes about a planet circling a star, which he says is Canopus, and that this planet is unique. It's a dune star. It's a sand star. And on this planet is a spice which spans time and space, and certain people have taken this and they have become transformed, and this is then what becomes known as the Guild of Space Navigators, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. Now, all of this is existing star lore about Canopus. In Arab countries, Canopus used to be called the navigator of the desert because it was a polar star. It denominated the South Pole. People tracking across the desert by nighttime could use it to find out in which direction they were going. And obviously the intriguing thing is that Frank Herbert not only talks about navigators, when we come to the name of the Grand Master of the Priory of Zion, Pierre Blanchard does not call himself Grand Master, but he calls himself Notonnier, which in English translates as navigator. It's an amazing coincidence, which, kind of like Canopus seems to stretch the boundaries of coincidence even further, that Frank Herbert came across this all by accident. Yet, in the very little material I have read about his personal life, he just seemed to be saying that he didn't really have an esoteric interest, and then all of this came to him by accident. But then so many things of great writers seem to come to them as if by divine choice. And actually the word which was on the tip of my mouth was divine seeding. It's almost that sometimes people pick up on certain material and just transform this into an amazing amount of words which are just impossible to ever do by anybody else. And I'm thinking here about the Lord of the Rings, the Harry Potters, the Dune material. Some would say the Star Wars material as well. It's all of that stuff which is using myths of the ancient world, sometimes by accident, sometimes by sheer luck. But you read some science fiction by Frank Herbert, and once again you come across that there is something about Canopus in there which is kind of like staggering, specifically because it touches upon this transformative aspect, what I kind of like call, how humans can be transformed into deity, which is all what I think, Stargates were about. It's how we can transcend into something which is beyond the mere mortal realm.
Yeah, isn't that finally taking us to the apex of what this incredible body of mystic literature that surrounds Canopus is actually pointing to, and that is the potential for the transformation of the individual. It seems that each of the steps that we follow, Philip Coppens, Frank Herbert, we follow the ancient Egyptian references, we follow those of Enki, a common denominator in all of them is this insistence that not only can we, but we must transform. And one of the steps, or one of the key lessons of all of this, is to begin to learn to live in a post-technological world. Can you talk about that for a moment, what Canopus seems to be offering in terms of a message in that regard?
Yes, I mean, again, I think here we are using Canopus as a symbolism. It was how the ancient Egyptians tried to depict something, which is so fundamental. And they did it because to them Canopus was the South Polar Star. And when you look at other researchers, such as David Ulanisi, who talks about the same concept, but from a Mitraic kind of view, you always find that same message, which is, a call upon arms, if you want, for mankind to, yes, live properly, but also to realize that you live within a larger framework. And we can talk a lot about religions, but the one thing where I think it's written down in the most beautiful and the most direct and in a quite non-religious manner are the Hermetic texts, the Corpus Hermeticum. There you read about how, we are here to contemplate the universe. Yes, we're allowed to slaughter cows if we want to eat, but it's kind of like, saying, but remember, you are more than just human. And when we're talking about how we should transform, I think it's the fact that religions don't focus on that anymore. Religion, kind of like focuses on very basic things at the moment, and specifically after the 15th century, which gave us all of this tremendous science, the possibility that you and I talk to each other, probably not even with wires connected, but via satellite. All of that gave us tremendous advantages, but at the same time came at a cost. And the diversity of religions and the bickering which goes on between the various religions actually means that neither science nor religion is able to offer us this. Now, sidestepping this slightly, Robert Lomas, in his book The Invisible College, actually came upon a text by Isaac Newton, whereby it was the dream of Newton and several of his contemporaries to kind of like prove the existence of God. He wanted to use physics and everything of science which was at his disposal to prove the existence of God. Now, you might actually say that we are succeeding in this, and I hinted upon the quantum physical work of Amit Goswami, and even if you don't go as far in quantum physics as Goswami has gone, it does talk about a specific role of consciousness, but there's still a long way to go. I think, if anything, that us letting go of our old materialistic self, if you want, will happen gradually, as long as these things will grow and keep on growing, as young children will no longer learn the old physics of many centuries ago almost, but will start to learn quantum physics as from the age of 12 onwards. And sure, there can be paradigm shifts in which certain things will take a giant leap forward, but if that doesn't happen, I'm sure that on a gradual process we will still go in the right direction.
I totally agree, Philip, and I think that we're on the verge of discovering or rediscovering the primordial sacred science of the gods. And as you note, and others have noted, including myself, modern physics and ancient symbolists use the exact same symbols. I mean, Stargate and wormhole symbolism is rampant in ancient temples. How would you explain that?
Very difficult, but I think, the best way in trying to answer that is by quoting Carl Gustav Jung, who talks about archetypes. And here we've got something, which is at the very heart of so many things, including the entire UFO phenomenon, which people are becoming more open to its other possibilities. It's got to do with the fact that, yes, there seems to be something inside of us, inside our mind, which just kind of like by a click of the finger seems to open us to a new possibility. And, yes, when I saw the depictions of the Maitreya cult, which is literally a circle with writing on it, and you look at depictions of Stargate SG-1, the television series, they are identical.
Yeah. Have you had any contact with any of the writers of the Stargate series of the movies?
No, not at all.
Yeah, I'm very curious about them. I haven't either, but they are clearly drawing from some of the profound well that you're certainly drawing from as well. one of the concepts that I was most curious to ask you about too was this. You mentioned it in the Canopus Revelation, is this whole idea of shape-shifting and of dual beings. Could you talk for us for a moment about what you found in this concept of humans as being more than human and the symbolism of the dual beings, including the mermaid and other beings?
Yes. The shape-shifting stuff is partly just shamanic. It's, probably quite well known to a lot of your listeners. However, there's something else, which is the fact that the ancient Egyptians said that we had more than just one type of body, and they kind of like, we could kind of like say, okay, yeah, they thought about the spirit, so that's probably one. Perhaps the astral body, that's probably two. The physical body, that makes it three. Well, guess what? The ancient Egyptians thought there were at least seven. So where did the other four, come from and go to? So it's that kind of thing. It's got to do with what we call ghosts. What kind of energy is that? It's not something of what I would call the astral body, not definitely the physical body. Doesn't seem to be very much like the spirit body either, but nevertheless, people who feel and see presences of both, there is something there. There is some type of energy there. So it's very difficult to say about transforming and shape shifting. And some of these coils, according to the ancient Egyptian belief, when you died, you didn't have to worry about them. It just kind of like was thrown off. Definitely, we know our physical body deteriorates after death, though, of course, in some cases it doesn't. And it's got to do with all of these interfaces between conscious shape shifting, what shamans did in rituals, in their almost day-to-day activity, and there you get the form of the man changing into a werewolf, or the man changing into an eagle, or just any other animal. But then at the same time, you do find that your own body, once again according to ancient Egyptian doctrine, but definitely not unique to ancient Egyptian belief, had so many other aspects to this.
Yeah, and in conjunction with these dual beings, I've been intrigued by the appearance of gateways, or of beings that are standing in gateways or portals, and you begin to develop this concept that these are some kind of a vibratory doorway, if you will, and that perhaps this shape-shifting or the dual being was a part of them that was created in order to go through one of these tuned initiatory chambers, if you will. Talk about that in connection with these gateways. What do you feel is going to be, as we embark upon this quest now to, in fact, try to duplicate the feats of the gods and perhaps design gateways for our future, what's it going to be like in terms of humankind and the interface with those gateways? Any ideas?
Let me take it to a very personal, individual level, whereby we kind of like know that when people die, they have what science is now calling near-death experience. But in essence, it is the death experience. It's just that these people are pulled back from death. So it's near-death isn't kind of like a good term. It's the death experience as told by people who returned from it. Now, when you drive at night in summer and it's dark with full headlights, you see all of these little insects who just see a bright light and they just rush towards it and they die. Even though there's an enormous amount of space around it, there's something in them which kind of like says, yeah, there's light, let's fly to it. And I think that's also what kind of like happens a lot in the death experience. You say, you hear people say, yes, there was this tunnel of light, and at the end of the tunnel there was a bright light. And everybody just kind of like floats through it. They go to the light. You kind of think, well, what about the tunnel, guys? Might there be something there in the tunnel? Might there be something while you are going to the slide which goes into another direction? Now, this may seem outlandish, but in the book I go into the subject of how I think the interior of the Great Pyramid is a physical representation of what the ancient Egyptians believed happened to the soul. And in essence, when you go down into the Great Pyramid, you just go down all the way down. And it's only when you kind of like do a detailed analysis of the descending shaft that you will find that there's actually an ascending passage which will take you to the two upper chambers. And I think it's that kind of thing. I think before we start even trying to conquer, if you want, the forces or the vibrational energies or whatever you want to call it, which will lead us to something else, I think it is required that there's a certain maturity of the dying spirit, not to just straightforwardly rush towards the light, but take it very slowly, one step at a time. So, a bit like the firefly who would come back each time upon his death and would reincarnate till he finally realizes that he shouldn't just rush towards any oncoming headlight because it'll kill him. And I think, the very fact that only have accounts of people who constantly rush towards these lights at the end of the tunnel, I think it's great that we start to accumulate all of this material, but I think at the moment that we do not have an all-encompassing view of what people go through, and I think certain people, what I would call mature souls, who kind of like, are experienced in magic or perhaps have had many cycles of reincarnation, perhaps they would not straightforwardly rush to the light as most fireflies, but would kind of like feel out a bit what is in this tunnel rather than just rush to the light and see what's there.
Hitting the tunnels. By the way, Philip, what's next for you?
What's next for me? Well, I've written the manuscript on the Holy Grail. I know it's very unoriginal for me to do this at the time of the Da Vinci Code,
right?
But it does tackle the Grail from a completely different angle. In very short and without saying too much about it, it takes Wolfram von Eschenbach's book for real, saying this guy never wrote fiction in his life, so why would a story about the Grail be fiction? And all the names in his book, like Enfortius or Percival, I've been able to tie with real life characters who live, in a real world, and the relationship that Wolfram gives in his novel, between parentheses once again, quotation marks, those relationships, those family relationships, come out one for one in the real characters. And yes, the people who in real life, read of which the story is written, yes, they did have something to do with the Grail.
Very interesting. So you're able to match them with real historical figures. That'll change things. We talked about Rennes-le-Château a couple of times, and I can tell that it's a source of great passion. Where's that Rennes-le-Château story going? Do you think that the Da Vinci Code is having a positive effect on the revelation of the secrets, or do you think that maybe that it's just going to serve to further burying the real history there?
I think it's good that the Da Vinci Code was written, and the impact that it's had is just phenomenal. I wouldn't specifically agree with Dan Brown on all points, but then I think Dan Brown will be the first to say that it's fiction. As to the subject of Rennes-le-Château, I think he's made it more difficult, because even though he doesn't talk about Rennes-le-Château per se, he does talk about the big theories, the Henry Lincolns and their Holy Bloods and Holy Grails, and in which he kind of like argues that the secret of Rennes-le-Château has got to do with the bloodline of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. I don't think that's the case. When you look at what Pierre Plantard believed, he didn't go on about it. Only very late in life, many years, I think about 7 years after Henry Lincoln had gone for the bloodline theory in his book. Did Plantar kind of like, not endorse the bloodline thinking, but kind of like started mentioning it a bit. But it wasn't about that at the beginning. It all had to do about trying to figure out what Sonia in Rennes-le-Château had been doing. And I actually think that the mystery of Rennes-le-Château is not so much the mystery linked to the place, but has all got to do with the mystery of what the village priest, Berenger Saunière, was involved with. And actually, when you look at that, you actually find that Saunière, most of his time, tried to be somewhere else than Rennes-le-Château. He was in various other places trying to do research, trying to meet people, talking to families. He just had the unfortunate accident, if you want, that his work was in Rennes-le-Château, so he had to spend a certain amount of time in the village. But I think at the core, it's about Saunière, not about Rennes-le-Château. And,
well, Philip, I hope you'll come back in the future and talk with us about your research into the Angel Society and some of the other aspects of Rennes-le-Château. And I certainly want to thank you for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
And this is Whitley Strieber. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe. You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and gives you the facts that others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week, the first of a two-part report on the experiences of Bruce Maccabee, renowned UFO researcher and physicist, with a man known only as Hawk, a UFO whistleblower with official connections, or is he? Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Some of the startling facts that are emerging from research about the V-2 rocket history at White Sands Proving Ground in the late 1940s are New Mexico and Texas and other newspaper headlines about what was called, quote, peculiar phenomena, unquote, that were interfering with those early rocket launches. The peculiar phenomena were causing the rockets to veer off course. Photographs showed the peculiar phenomena were circular discs that instantaneously appeared next to the V-2s right before the rockets went off course and crashed to the ground. General Nathan Twining even referred to the discs as an enemy weapon system, according to government insiders who have leaked information in the past 10 years. That was not known to those 1947 newspaper reporters. They also did not know that the Truman administration had secretly ordered the American military to shoot down the disc technology. United States pilots tried shooting at many of the discs, but there was retaliation. The retaliation included plane crashes and reports of beams that could capture a plane and pilot in midair and cause them to vanish. According to off-the-record testimonies and leaked documents, such midair captures were even watched on radar. Now, for the first time, UFO investigator Bruce Maccabee, Ph.D., who has worked more than 30 years as a research physicist at the U.S. Naval Surface Warfare Center in Dahlgren, Maryland, is reporting information that he learned from an American Air Force officer in late 1985 to early 1986, and that information includes American aggression against a UFO and retaliation. Dr. Maccabee and I know the true identity of this source, but at the present time, the man will be called Hawk. In the late 1950s, Hawk became a weather officer for the U.S. Air Force. Then he studied geology, and by the mid-1960s was doing geological measurements related to underground atomic bomb tests. A decade later, in the 1970s, Hawk was working in the Advanced Physics branch of the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Hawk was known to another Wright-Patterson scientist named Robert Collins, co-author of the 2005 book entitled Exempt from Disclosure, written with former Air Force Office of Special Investigations counterintelligence agent Richard C. Doty. Hawk's knowledge about UFOs is discussed in that book, which provoked Dr. Maccabee to finally release the details of his own discussion with Hawk 20 years ago. Ironically, it was Robert Collins back then who arranged the meeting between Bruce Maccabee and Hawk. My interview with Dr. Maccabee this week provides important insights about our government's knowledge of the UFO phenomenon despite official denials in the interest of national security. In order to provide Dreamland listeners as much of this valuable information as possible, I am reporting in two parts, beginning this week and continuing in next week's broadcast. This report begins with Hawk's own first-hand experiences with UFOs as he described to Dr. Maccabee in mid-November 1985.
As he was an Air Force Reserve Officer Training Corps, Air Force ROTC, and he was about to go regular Air Force. They gave him a tour of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and at various buildings there, and he described how he was with a small group of guys that somehow wandered off on their own away from the main tour group, and in order to catch up with the main tour group, they decided to cut through a shortcut through some temporary rooms that have been set up inside a building, which simply by setting up, I gather, these little movable wall type things that you can just put them up and you've got yourself instantaneous rooms. And so they're going through one and they find some models of craft there, various types of, I guess, conventional aircraft and some that were far out like a flying wing, and then I believe he said there was a cigar shape, but also what attracted him was a disc-shaped thing. One or two discs that were very carefully made out of wood. Now, when he described it as being a pancake-shaped disc craft with a tail coming up in the back, what popped into my mind was the picture that's in Case 10 of Special Report Number 14 by Project Blue Book and the Battelle Memorial Institute. Case 10 is a report of an object seen by 5 witnesses near the road, who were fishing the Rogue River in Oregon in May of 1949. And two of the guys worked for the Ames Research Laboratory in San Francisco, where they did aeronautics research of various types. And they looked at this object through binoculars, and it was a flat disc-shaped thing with a tail on the back. I sent a copy of this picture to Hawk, and he said it was like what he had seen, and then he went ahead and drew his own version of what he saw with a very rather accurate or carefully drawn circular-shaped object with something almost like a little flat dome on the top, and one tail fin or something, a vertical stabilizer or whatever you want to call it on the back end. The people who saw this object near the Rogue River described it as coming along, hovering over the river, not making any sound at all, rotating on its vertical axis and then accelerating to the speed of a jet in a few seconds, and never making any sound. So whatever it was the Rogue River people saw was pretty bizarre, and that may well have been the inspiration for this model that Hawk says he saw when he was with his friends. And he also says that one of the buddies that was with him, one of the guys that was with him, recognized these things. He says that, and this other kid said that it's what his father had been telling him about, flying saucers.
And that the father was an Air Force officer stationed at Wright-Pat Air Force Base in Ohio.
Right. Then the next thing that happened to him was a really bizarre story.
And that was spring of 1959.
But he was stationed at the headquarters, I believe he said it was the 8th Air Force headquarters in Misawa, Japan. And he had taken courses in meteorology At this time, he was the meteorologist who was providing weather reports for the air traffic control center, the radar control center at this Air Force base.
In Japan.
In Japan. While he was there one day, they were giving him a tour of this radar control center. He had been there for a few months or something like that, and he was now being given a tour of it. He was standing there talking to some person who was giving him the tour when suddenly things started to happen. How he gets this information out of it, somehow words or information is being handed back and forth verbally by these people watching the radar screens and the guy who's in charge of the whole operation. Some word comes that they're back again. And Hawk asks his friend, who's back? And his friend says, oh, these things happen, something like they happen often, you know. One or two objects will come towards Japan and then set up in a holding pattern or just stay there stationary for a period of time and then suddenly take off and head west. And he said this is somewhat approximately over the area between the North and South Islands of Japan.
And the commander says, quote, we'll scramble, unquote. What happened?
Yeah. These objects had become stationary, and the question was, what do we do about it? Apparently this thing had happened before, something like it anyway, had happened before. And so the guy who was in charge decided to send up aircraft to investigate. And Hawk said that he had been told that there were two specially instrumented F-106s. And he says he thought that at the time that was strange because F-106s had barely been introduced in the United States. And if you actually look up the history of F-106s, I think the first one was in 1955 or 56.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, a search was made by Don Berliner to find out if there were any missing F-106s. And I believe he did find 4 that they couldn't account for.
And the implication was that a brand new airplane that was designed for fighting had been especially equipped to attack, we'll call them alien flying machines or
right.
UFOs.
Yeah, I don't know whether you'd say they had special devices for attacking, but I got the impression that these were special devices that were instruments for making measurements or something like that. They may have had weapons. They obviously had weapons on the airplanes as well. According to Hawk, he was told that there were 2 especially instrumented aircraft, and that when they decided to scramble, one guy couldn't get his special instrument to be working, so the other guy, they only scrambled one aircraft. And then Hawk was asked to provide a weather, what would the guy see from the point of view of the weather? And Hawk said it was a full moon up above a uniform cloud cover at 10,000 feet or something like that. And as soon as the guy broke through the cloud cover, he'd have clear visibility. So he said that he couldn't hear the radar controllers talking into their microphones next to their desks or whatever, but they had put the voice of the pilot onto a loudspeaker so that everybody could hear it. And the pilot talked about climbing up through the clouds and then seeing, lo and behold, there's this object, I don't know, a light, a structured craft or something, 5 or 10 miles away from him, some distance away. And he asks what to do, and he's told to just go into a holding pattern, so I guess he essentially starts flying around in circles until they tell him what to do. And Hawk said that at this point, the commander, guy in charge of the radar installation, put through a call to Washington, D.C. to find out what to do. And Hawk was impressed because the guy got a very quick response using what was then a sort of a new form of radar, a radio transmission known as single sideband transmission. Hawk said that he was in weather forecasting and had to have quick responses on things like monsoons and stuff that might start up and create bad weather. So he was accustomed to having, or usually would get a response, but even his responses might take him 10 or 15 or 20 minutes or an hour or something like that to come back. He was impressed because they got a response almost within minutes. So it was obviously a pretty important thing that somebody in Washington, D.C. Was prepared for, I guess. Anyway, the word came back to roll in and basically attack this object, which basically meant he was now heading towards this object, and he was firing all his missiles, however many that might have been. I presume they were early versions of the Sidewinder missile, which is a heat-seeking missile. And there would be some period of time as the missiles are traveling, and then the pilot said that the missiles had all exploded before they hit the craft, the object. And then he said that this object had turned on a blue beam, and it was rotating, and the beam was it was starting to move towards him. At which point he went into a dive, and Hawk said he was impressed at the voice of the pilot suddenly went up into this high falsetto, an indication of controlled fear. And the pilot was turning and trying to go away from this object. And on the radar scope, he said that he could see the spots getting closer to one another, and then they merged. And there was just one dot on the radar, and the radar people didn't know what to do, and then all of a sudden that dot disappeared. And Hawk said that for the next 48 hours he was giving weather forecasts as to what they would find while they were doing this search. And according to Hawk, they never found anything, no wreckage, nothing.
Well, as I read this manuscript, it seemed to me, Bruce, that one of the most important insights from this man who was working at a classified level inside of our government with some knowledge, or in some areas they had knowledge about unidentified flying objects and their occupants, was that he knew firsthand we tried to attack and there was retaliation.
Right. He and others were told officially that it never happened. The plane was lost, but for some other reason. And he asked if the event were classified, and he was told no, because it didn't happen, and you can't classify something that didn't happen. So in other words, that's sort of how they got away with it. There's no supporting information, only the people who were there at the time, and they're not going to talk.
And could you explain, then, from Japan, how he came to be convinced that we actually were dealing with extraterrestrial biological entities?
Well, I think that convincing probably came during the late 70s. And into the 80s, based on a bunch of what people had told him, although if you read in Collins' book, you get the impression that Hawk knew a lot more than what he told me. What he told me was sort of like the tip of the iceberg. He started off with his own experiences, and then went into what other people had told him. Now, his third semi-direct personal experience occurred in the middle 60s, when he was at a conference in Albuquerque. My understanding of the conferences had to do with his geological work in monitoring these underground nuclear explosions, often called UGTs, underground test. He was at a conference there, and with a buddy of his, he and some other people were invited to go to a facility southeast of Kirtland Air Force Base, and I believe that the buildings are still there, a facility where they did nuclear tests on animals. And the way he described it was they would have these animal pens around this area in this facility, and they would take them into a building where they would put the animal in a room, and then they would have a radioactive source of nuclear radiation that was in a underground vault to minimize the radiation hazard to people who worked there. Mm-hmm. After the animal was inside this presumably radiation-shielded room, they would then bring up this, raise the source of radiation up to the point where it was irradiating the animal for some period of time, and then they would put it back down under the ground. And so he was invited along with some other guys to go and see this facility. And he went there, and he described how the various men had various rankings and degrees and so on. And while his group was there, they noticed that there was another small group of guys from the Navy, and he said that they were saying, you think that the Air Force guys have a lot of degrees and so on. The guys in the Navy, they have several doctorates. They are doctors. They have PhDs. They have other degrees and so on and ranking. And somebody asked, why do they need all that, all those degrees to do whatever it is they're doing? And according to Hawk, the reason was because they were working on aliens.
Extraterrestrial biological entities.
And Hawk says the word goes around that must be bullshit. But nevertheless, his friend Bob got interested and decided to see if he could get in on the work. And Bob was told, well, you don't ask them, they invite you.
And Bob Hippler was...
And Hippler becomes a real person. As you've read what I wrote, right. You know how the effect on me of finding his name in a document written by Jim McDonald.
That's right. Exactly.
My eyes were going across the page reading fast, and I hit that word, and my eyeballs just stopped moving.
Yeah.
It was like I was frozen in space.
And
I'd never expected to find a real person that connected with this guy, Bob Hippler.
And who was Bob Hippler?
I don't know what Hippler's rank was at the time. I think he was might have been a captain or something. Well, Hippler was told about a number of facilities in the Albuquerque area and Kirtland Air Force Base where research was done on aliens. And some pretty strange things, like he said, the tramway. What's that called?
Yeah, it's called the Sandia Tramway.
The Sandia Tramway Company was actually a cover for an organization that had built a meeting place for people who were controlling all information having to do with aliens, what we might call MJ-12, but Hawk didn't use that terminology. There were some other buildings in the Albuquerque area which were associated with this project having to do with aliens, according to Hawk. But again, this is according to Hawk saying what he was told back in the middle 60s. And he and Bob Hippler drove around Albuquerque, actually finding these various places, confirming that the actual places existed. Of course, they couldn't confirm what was going on. But so after this conference was over, Hippler and Hawk went their separate ways. And it was some couple of years later, I believe, according to Hawk, he ran into Bob Hippler and said, did you ever get that job that you wanted, whatever it was Hippler wanted to join this work on aliens? He recalls Hippler saying, and he recalls it because Hippler said it 3 times, I'm now a member of the real Project Blue Book. I'm now a member of the real Project Blue Book. And once again. And so Hawk remembers him saying it 3 times. He didn't know what Blue Book was, but he remembers Hippler referring to it 3 times and saying it was the real one.
The Jim McDonald that Dr. Maccabee references was Dr. James E. McDonald, the senior physicist at the Institute for Atmospheric Physics and professor in the Department of Meteorology at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Throughout the 1960s, Dr. McDonald interviewed hundreds of UFO witnesses and uncovered many government documents related to the phenomenon. He testified before Congress during the 1968 UFO hearings called by Congressman Gerald Ford. Dr. McDonald was highly critical of the United States Air Force's Project Blue Book. Dr. McDonald and serious UFO investigators thought that the University of Colorado Condon report associated with the public Project Blue Book was phony, a government attempt to whitewash the real phenomenon, the real Project Blue Book. Now, Dr. Maccabee has reinforced that contention with Hawk's revelation that there was another real Project Blue Book. There were 2 Project Blue Books, a phony one to keep the public and media away, from the real Blue Book investigation.
Next week on Dreamland at Last, the truth behind Project Blue Book revealed.
Myths, mysteries, and metaphysics. And one of the topics that we certainly want to talk with you about as we continue is this concept of the star Canopus as the stargate to the afterlife realm of Osiris in ancient Egyptian religion. And in fact, you go on to describe Canopus as a sort of transformation station where Osiris was transformed into a super god. Can you talk for us a moment about how you came upon this understanding of Canopus, how this star that perhaps many of us have never even heard of, which was the second brightest star in the sky in the ancient world and still is in the southern hemisphere, came to be such a hidden mystery, and why it's so important for us now to understand or get a handle on the Canopus revelation?
Yes, I mean, first of all, I think we can't take the Canopus as a stargate literally. It's a symbolism. It's, the Egyptians used Canopus as a symbol to describe how what happened to the soul once the soul died. So it's a symbolic stargate for something which is much more personal, which happens on a metaphysical level when you die. Now, as to why it got forgotten, I have no idea. All I know is that people in recent decades constantly hinted at Canopus, and it came up in the most unusual aspects. It was Robert Temple who, while he was writing the Sirius mystery, kept saying things about Sirius, but at the same time was saying, well, this Canopus thing and this Canopus thing. I was reading a book by John North about Stonehenge, and in there he just makes a comparison how the Kaaba, of such importance to the Arab world, was aligned to Canopus. And all of these things left, right, and center. And I kind of thought, I don't have to do...
Look, I'm going to be doing the subscriber interview, and I'm going to be challenging him to tell us what the secret of the ancient Egyptians was. How can we make the journey out of the whole trap of reincarnation that they made or they believed that they could make? Is there anything we can do now to make this work for us, for subscribers? William Henry, in just a moment, is going to be exploring the Canopus revelation. And if you're a subscriber, do listen to both programs, because William has an absolutely fascinating take on this deep knowledge, of course, of ancient Egypt and its mythology. So don't miss it. This is Whitley Strieber, and when we come back, it'll be William Henry substituting on Dreamland.
From Nashville, this is William Henry sitting in for Whitley Strieber. This is Dreamland. Welcome, everyone. Our guest today is investigator and journalist Philip Coppens from Scotland. In addition to revealing vital, lost knowledge about the truth behind extraterrestrial contact and military intelligence's interest in ancient Egypt, Philip has also done extensive research on what the Egyptians believed happened to the soul after death. To top it off, he writes about the myths and secret history of Rennes-le-Château, the real secret history. He writes about Rosslyn Chapel and much, much more of interest that we'll get into today. He recently appeared at Dreamland favorite guest Andrew Collins' Questing Conference along with Graham Phillips, another Dreamland contributor, where Philip introduced his new and important work, the Canopus Revelation, Stargate of the Gods, and the Ark of Osiris. Are the secrets of the Gate of the Gods about to be revealed by modern science? Let's find out. Philip, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you very much.
Hey, great to have you here. I really thank you very much for taking time to speak with us. I really appreciate it. And in reading your bio, Philip, it looks like you've had a lifetime interest in esoteric studies and enigmas of the past. As you're a new guest, could you just talk for a moment about how or anything that's at work right now?
It's a tough question. I think it's always bubbling underneath the surface. When you look at how people like, just for example, British Prime Minister's wife, Cherie Blair, is interested in things which have got to do with what we would call New Age, but, it's kind of like, well, why is she rushing so often to these astrologers? An example, Princess Diana, which is so tabloid, people fail to perhaps see what it's like, but she also rushed to these astrologers that out, if you want, as a guidance to their life. And if you look at, not on the magical sense, but if you look at the politics of George Bush, and even though he then denies it, then underlines the fact, this mission of God thing is very similar to what the magicians of Argeny or his predecessors, including probably his father in the 1970s, were involved with. They have this sense that they are not just mere mortals and that they're just doing what they think is best. They always feel that they are pawns in a much larger game in which God or God are there, and they try to follow God's orders, if you want, to try to find out what the bigger plan, which isn't visible in this world, wants them to do.
Great. Yeah, well, I really appreciate you commenting on that, Philip, because, again, I thought the Stargate Conspiracy was an important work, and you were the person behind that driving the research. At least that seems to be the credit given to you in the book, and so thanks for bringing us up to speed on that. Recently on Dreamland, we've been discussing quite a bit about what I call Stargate still in play.
I think it's more than that. I think it's got to do with the relationship of politics and magic. And in magic, which goes far way back beyond ancient Egypt, you've got the concept of how to control the world through magic, how does the world work, access to other dimensions, access to different knowledge. And ancient Egypt is just one component of this. What we didn't go into the book was how in France at the very same time you had people who started doing exactly the same thing. But there you don't have the emphasis on 9 ancient Egyptian deities. You've got the 9 Templars. So in France you've got the Argeny revival. But once again, you find politicians are in there from the very word go. And really what was in the Stargate Conspiracy, and which applies to American politics, you can apply it with other examples to French politics. And you can, I think, in the history of Rennes le Château, you see examples of how, for example, in 17th century France, people tried doing the same thing, but, within a different concept. So Egypt still is a prized possession, but it's not that we should overemphasize on Egypt. And I think what the Stargate Conspiracy tried to do was say exactly that. If you just focus too much on Egypt, you will end up doing some pretty nasty, pretty self-indulgent, pretty, should I say, stupid things.
Yeah, and of course, since the publication of the Stargate Conspiracy in '99, we've had the dramatic moves that the U.S. military and the coalition has made in Iraq, and it appears that it isn't just Egypt, that in fact it really is the entire Middle East that is the concentrated focus of these magicians. And can you, off the top of your head, think of any examples of where this magical worldview is evident in contemporary politics, say within the past year? You came upon interest in this area, and what provokes you to continue today?
I can. It started off about around the age of 18, when I think, like so many other people in this lifetime, you kind of like have to figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life. And I didn't really know, I think, much like any other 18-year-old. So I thought about what I could do, and amongst the choices which I probably didn't consider doing was journalism. So I started doing some kind of like, what kind of journalism would I do? And again, of all the options available, the ones you don't think about are the ones you end up with doing. So I did a bit of investigative journalism, did a bit of local newspaper material, and I got involved into what I would call investigative journalism surrounding the Kennedy assassination and all of those things. This was the early 1990s when a guy called Bill Cooper, if I remember correctly, started saying a few big tales about why Kennedy was killed, and it involved UFOs, it involved secrets about extraterrestrials, it involved something which he referred to as the Roswell crash, and I'd never heard about. And from there, my life just went what my parents would probably think is a completely wrong way, but what I think is a very funny way, and that's where I am at the moment, in between bypassing such things as Eric von Däniken's Ancient Astronauts material, Templar Revelation, Stargate Conspiracy, and in recent years a few of my own books.
Right, yeah. I wanted to touch on that, Philip, too. The fact that in 1999 you were the principal researcher for Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince's The Stargate Conspiracy. A very controversial book which blew the lid off current politicians' apparent obsession with ancient Egypt and Mars and a possible alien agenda behind politics. Astounding book again. And in your view, do you think Egypt is still the prize, so to speak? Is Egypt